It's no secret that Kirby works with basically every genre, and it's interesting to observe how the series tackles each style of gameplay with pure accessibility in mind. Metroidvanias tend to lean on the complex side and require you to memorize rooms, upgrade your character consistently, and make logic of the labyrinth you find yourself in. Kirby and the Amazing Mirror borrows the very basic philosophy of a Metroidvania and tweaks the rules in order to implement a surprisingly elaborated multiplayer. Together you encounter powerful bosses from the mirror world, some of them resembling old rivals with altered designs. So let's see if they can stay toe to toe with their original counterparts or maybe even exceed them. Despite the fact I just mentioned modified enemies, surprisingly enough, Kreko is the only foe in this game staying completely untouched. This does not only apply to his design, as the battle itself is fundamentally every other Kreko battle you fought in past titles. Also, the volcanic area you find yourself in has nothing really to do with the one-eyed cloud per se, and you really get the impression he was a last moment addition in order to fill out the bosses. Even Kirby's Adventure implemented a short chasing sequence leading up to the real struggle, but the Amazing Mirror does not offer any special situation in any kind. You're going to dodge beams, smaller enemies, dashes, everything seen in other entries. Some people like to argue the mirror world is in the sky or some similar stuff, which is why Kreko simply visited this place by himself, but it doesn't change the fact that this rendition is extremely safe and uninspired. The main selling point of the Amazing Mirror is the multiplayer, and it would have been interesting to see the Thundercloud splitting himself up into different parts depending on how many players are on the field, for the sake of emphasizing the main selling point of the game and give every player a target to hit. It also has nothing to do with the hardware, as the first Game Boy already proved that creativity has nothing to do with the limitations of the console. Because of that, Kreko remains as the most forgettable boss and suffers from simply adding nothing. Just like Kreko before, the fight against the seeming Metanite plays out completely identical from what you know, and therefore comes across just as lazy. While the clash itself is nothing to gush about, at least the ambiente convinces with an atmospheric sunset that was established before the battle. Beating the mysterious foe, you are shocked with the classic reveal of Metanite's face, but this time it's Shadow Kirby who appears throughout the game and leaves items if you hit him. It's quite the waste to turn a proper boss fight against Shadow Kirby into a mere Metanite knockoff, and they could have done so many things with this rather unexplored character. Can Shadow Kirby inhale copy abilities? Does he have other unique traits that set him apart from Kirby? Take a look at Metanite's and DDD Star counterpart and you can clearly see how much more powerful they seem in comparison to their true selves. The fundament of using a Metanite blueprint isn't necessarily the issue here, as it serves the purpose of foreshadowing the fray against the real antagonist, but some special moves could have enhanced an otherwise way too standardized fight. As the first proper boss on this list and parallel version of Wispy Woods, King Golem is the only boss you have to conquer first, before choosing your own path. With every other boss, you're allowed to battle them in the order you like, but King Golem has to be beaten first, before the game truly opens up. Because of this, he is as plain as you would expect, but at least visually distinct. In comparison to the classic tree, rocks falling from above resemble the apples, and the stoic impression perfectly mirrors his stoic friend. It's a shame King Golem does not make use of his hands, only participating by clapping the ground. Still, if you take your time with this battle, you will at least see some unique tricks that send out little minions to the battlefield. Most people will end the fight before even seeing this, probably, but especially back in the day you would not expect more from the expected Wispy/Golem encounter. A neat touch that foreshadows all your main enemies in the future are window glasses in the background, each of them portraying one of the main bosses. It's one of the rare uses of background elements and sets the tone nicely for what is to come. Similar to King Golem, Whis is completely based on the past boss from Kirby's adventure, the Paint Roller. Both artists perform their attacks by summoning projectiles with their respective powers, in Whis' case with his magical hat. Even the arena layout is nearly identical, with one smaller quality of life improvement by placing a platform in the middle. Apart from that, there's once again sadly not too much setting Whis apart from the Paint Roller, which is a shame considering the unique setup of the game using past bosses, but changing them into something presumably new. Normally the creators have to always assume people may start with a respective new game, hence not relying too much on past knowledge about mechanics or characters. Theoretically, Amazing Mirror strikes a perfect balance on paper by principally utilizing established characters but changing their appearance due to the story premise. It's an ideal combination of nostalgia and innovations, without coming across as uncreative on paper. Just like Whis and every boss before on this list, this is a main critique of the Amazing Mirror, not making use of the cards they have in their hands. And you can see with Krakow sometimes there are even more imaginative renditions many years ago. If you want to nitpick, the same applies to Whis, as he lacks the smaller details in his animations, like Paint Roller performing a smaller wall jump instead of magically gliding through the air, or catching you off guard with the drift if you try to hide in a corner. Something Kirby games definitely indoctrinated you to do based on past games. Ultimately, it's not as detrimental as I make it out to be, but only a sign that there is always room to improve. Mini-bosses are no unfamiliar feature for the franchise, just like Easter eggs from other IPs. Sometimes whole level ideas are strictly copied, and there's no denial Kirby combined some of Nintendo's most established creative endeavors in its level design. Amazing Mirror did go one step further and implemented the Master Hand from Smash as a surprising mini-boss. Every attack is simply adopted from the original, with the special Smash ability being one of the most versatile ones to this day. To spare some development time and increase the fan service one step further, one of the main bosses are both Master and Crazy Hand, but unfortunately it's not as exciting as you would think. To put it in cynical terms, fundamentally you're fighting just two Master Hands, with Crazy Hand not even portraying any of the uncommon movement known from Smash. There's the fitting accomplishment of factoring the multiplayer into the battle, as your team can split into two groups to focus on both hands simultaneously, and the mere thought of realizing a Smash character will never be not charming. Dark Metanite is basically the upgraded version of the regular Metanite confrontation and builds on that foundation by being quicker, more unpredictable, and adding minor additions. Going into this fight with the knowledge of modern Kirby games, especially Star Allies, it might be disappointing to find out that the Dark Knight lacks all the mirror-based techniques, but you have to be aware that this first taste of the climax resembles the structure of a contemporary Kirby final. Back in the day, it wasn't quite as common to have these multi-phased endings, with countless seeming final bosses appearing and appearing without a light in sight. Amazing Mirror kinda set the stone for such a structure, which is why Dark Metanite is simply the appetizer for what is to come. And even for that, it's serviceable with some strong skills, an intimidating setting, and powerful soundtrack. Even Metanite has a smaller role by offering his sword not to cross blades with him, and ultimately landing his very own sword for the upcoming struggle. At last, the first original boss, which is not based on an enhanced mini-boss or enemy from the past. Moly is a short-sighted mammal guarding one of the mirror pieces deep in the caves of the mirror world, and switches places quickly by digging through holes. While mining, he finds all sorts of trash to throw at you, and combines a rather passive approach with quick projectiles. Similar to the Smash Hands, Moly makes perfect use of the multiplayer aspect, but enhances the potential with a spontaneous change of pace. With potentially 4 players on the field, everyone is gathered around the arena, so theoretically there's no place for the mole to hide, as there will be the surprising moment of his nose sticking out of the dirt when you are actually trying to hide. Also, having a smaller ceiling, there is a sense of an enclosed atmosphere, fantastically fitting to the world's setting, resulting in the first properly realized new boss of the amazing mirror. Nowadays, water-based bosses seem to appear less and less in modern titles, but back in the day it was certainly not surprising, and Gobler convinced with his goofy design and quite a decent battle. Other than a handful of abilities, Kirby is very restricted underwater, and can only shoot water bubbles as a means to strike his foes. To add some flexibility to the arena, there's the chance to stay above the dangerous water, but mainly for hiding purposes. With quick dashes, Gobler rushes through the battleground and sometimes summons his children when child support becomes too much. It's a little unfortunate there are not more unique moves or making use of the multiplayer aspect, but Gobler simply stands out by his strange design and fast-paced movement. Obviously there are some considerations to improve on, like the general speed of the fight. Gobler by himself is fast, but takes a little too long to attack, and by the time he actually starts to pose a menace, the battle will be over when all Kirby simultaneously spit on the fish with problems to swim. Revealed to be the true antagonist all along, Darkmind is the malicious magician behind the mirror world, and final opponent to overcome. When you first start the fight, you might come across as a nightmare copycat, with a secret weak point under his coat and star-like projectiles, but this time with colors. Also, having the option to use Metanite's overpowered blade just destroys Darkmind's health bar, resulting in him splitting into pieces. Obviously there's more to see, and you find yourself in different short self-contained level sections, mirroring most places you have visited throughout the adventure. After each short sequence, basically a new, slightly more challenging phase starts, giving the whole staging a unique setup, still very individual for the series. There is the sense that you cannot quite know when the fight is going to end, or where it's even leading up to, and while the battle itself could be a little more creative and varied, it's still a fitting preparation for what is to come. After an ostensible endless battle against Darkmind, his true form starts to shine through and reveal itself to be a massive eyeball similar to past enemies like Zero. This time the fight takes much more slower pace, and the only way to deal any damage is a direct hit into the eye. Often Kirby bosses suffer from the design choice of being able to attack consistently, which makes foes like Whis Woods in many games laughable. The opposition simply gets no chance to show their tricks, which is why you often see people being surprised when an opponent uses a skill you have never seen before. Darkmind is different in that regard, as you can only strike consistently once, instead of dealing permanent damage all the time. With this approach, each sword swing has to be timed, and even if you still use Metanite's iconic blade, Darkmind will not be taken down so easily just like before. Despite the fact the arena seems to be placed in some sort of alternative dimension, it's commendable how Darkmind still incorporates the mirror theming by attacking with the magical objects itself, using them as reflectors for beam or summoning enemies in case you have no ability. Shifting the perspective adds a little difficulty curve in the second half of the battle, and regarding how frequently the game reuses bosses or concepts from prior entries, I'm extremely glad the true final encounter remains fully original with interesting ideas. Of course, it wouldn't be a Kirby title without one last icing on the cake, and after a challenging fight, it's time for the gimmick sequence, which is extremely strange in Hinds Sight. There was never a point where the player had to fly with a warp star and shoot something. This moment kinda resembles the level goals where you had to dodge obstacles, gather some items and leviate to the top. However, the controls are noticeably different, and it still confuses me why they even decided to implement such a strangely last phase. Still, this is not to say it's not enjoyable, as the battle is basically over and you can plainly give everything in and utterly destroy Dark Mind. To top the whole strangeness of this scene, once you defeat the health bar, the credits just start to roll, with no fanfare or any transition. For all the reasons Dark Mind's last fight appears to be quite odd, it also adds a certain unforgettable charm, which remains to be unique to this day. Robots. Mega Titan is a rather unusual boss, as you cannot deal any damage with regular attacks. The only exception are electric based skills like beam or plasma, but otherwise there's no other chance to crack the Iron Titan with 4 powerful floating fists. The only strategy to win is to push Mega Titan into one of the electric walls, while dodging his punches from every direction. It's a notable difference from any other premise in the game, and doesn't allow you to cheaply win by using an overpowered copy ability. Especially with 4 players on the field, the sheer chaos unfolds, and sometimes it can become hard to tell what can be considered a floating fists or panicking friend in the air. On top of that, Mega Titan is the only regular boss with 2 separate faces. After destroying the main body, a small horned machine pops out and shoots rockets as a projectile for you to inhale. The fight doesn't become harder, in fact it's basically over at this point, but having the contrast between an undestroyable monster and weak true core is all the more effective, especially if you had troubles pushing Mega Titan into the walls. His design is similarly fantastic, and while it's hard to mess up robot bosses, it's commendable how perfectly they nailed the simplistic character design of the series with a slightly intimidating touch, something the franchise is quite known for. Kirby games love to recycle most of the memorable bosses from the past, and I'm more than certain that everyone who experienced the amazing mirror will certainly remember this boss and wishes to see a modern interpretation. Deliberately or not, Amazing Mirror goes by its name and mirrors 5 unique and 5 recycled bosses if you don't split up Dark Mind. While I think the potential of those bosses is not even slightly exhausted and would certainly benefit from a remake, it's still quite the decent selection for the first original mainline Kirby GBA title. As usual, what are your favorite bosses, and are there some you could not find when playing the game? Due to the open nature of the world, there's not a specific difficulty curve for the bosses, something some people might see as a downside, but arguably all the more worth for a, to this day, unlike Kirby adventure.